The desert sun beat down on the dusty town square where a crowd had gathered around the auction platform, and Martha Henderson stood at the edge of that crowd, with her worn leather purse clutched tight against her chest, and her heart beating harder than it had in the 3 years since her husband Thomas had passed away. She had come to town that morning for flour and salt, but something had drawn her to the square where the monthly labor auction was taking place, and now she found herself staring at a man on the platform unlike any she had ever seen. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with skin weathered by years under the sun, but what made people whisper and point was the burlap sack covering his head and the heavy chains binding his wrists and ankles, and Sheriff Coleman stood beside him, reading from a paper that declared this man property of the county, sentenced to labor for debts he could not pay. The bidding started at $50, and Martha watched as the town's wealthy ranchers called out numbers like they were buying cattle, and the man on the platform stood perfectly still, except for the slight rise and fall of his chest beneath that sack, and something about his stillness spoke to Martha of dignity that could not be broken even by chains. When the bidding reached $200, most of the crowd had lost interest, and that's when Martha heard it so quiet. She almost missed it, and the words came from beneath that burlap sack, barely more than a whisper. "Please, just make it quick." Those 5 words pierced through Martha's heart like nothing had since she'd buried Thomas, and she thought about loneliness and what it meant to want an end to suffering. And before she knew what she was doing, her hand was in the air. $1, she called out, and her voice cracked on the words. The crowd fell silent and turned to stare at her, and Sheriff Coleman frowned down from the platform. "Ma'am, the bidding is at $200. "I know that, Sheriff, but I'm offering $1 for basic human decency. And I'm asking these fine people here if they really want to own another person's suffering, because that's what you're bidding on, isn't it?" And her voice grew stronger as she spoke. "And the only thing I want to own is the chance to do something right." The wealthy ranchers shifted uncomfortably and muttered among themselves, and one by one they lowered their hands and backed away from the platform, until finally Sheriff Coleman sighed and shook his head. "Sold to Martha Henderson for $1. And may God have mercy on us all." That's how Samuel came to walk beside Martha down the dusty road to her small farm on the edge of town, and she had paid her $1 and signed the papers. And when the sheriff removed Samuel's chains and that terrible burlap sack, she saw his face for the first time. He had kind eyes, she noticed, and sad ones too, and deep lines around his mouth that spoke of both laughter and sorrow. And he looked at her with confusion and something that might have been fear. "Ma'am, I don't understand what you want from me." Martha smiled gently and adjusted her sun hat against the glare. "What I want, Samuel, is for you to have supper and a good night's sleep, and tomorrow we'll figure out the rest." The walk to the farm took 30 minutes, and neither of them spoke much, and Martha pointed out landmarks along the way, and the old cottonwood where she and Thomas used to rest in its shade, and the creek that ran full in spring, but trickled now in the late summer heat, and the fence that needed mending, which she mentioned without expectation. When they reached the small farmhouse, Samuel stopped at the gate and looked at the neat garden and the chicken coop and the barn that leaned slightly to one side but still stood proud. "This is home," Martha said simply, "and you're welcome here for as long as you need." Over supper that evening, Martha learned bits of Samuel's story between bites of stew and cornbread, and he had been a carpenter once, with his own shop in a town 2 days' ride north, and when his wife died in childbirth along with their baby, he had fallen into despair and debt, and eventually ended up in chains. Martha listened without judgment, and when he finished, she told him about Thomas and how they had built this farm together over 30 years, and how the silence after he died had been the hardest thing she'd ever faced, and harder even than the work of keeping the farm running alone. "I understand wanting it to be quick," she said softly, "and there were days after Thomas passed when I stood in that barn and wondered why I should keep going." Samuel looked up from his plate. "And what changed your mind?" Martha smiled and reached across the table to pat his hand. "And nothing changed my mind exactly. But one morning the chickens needed feeding and the garden needed watering, and I realized that life doesn't ask if we're ready, and it just keeps needing things from us until one day we find we're living again without having decided to." That first week, Samuel slept in the barn at his own insistence, though Martha had offered the spare room, and he woke early each morning and mended the fence without being asked and repaired the barn door that had hung crooked. For 2 years and built new nesting boxes for the chickens. Martha would bring him lunch in the midday heat, and they would sit in the shade of the cottonwood and talk about small things and the weather and the crops and memories of people they had loved, and slowly, like ice melting in spring, something hard inside Samuel began to soften. On Sunday, Martha asked if he would accompany her to church, and Samuel hesitated and picked at a loose thread on his shirt. "Ma'am, I'm not sure I'm welcome in a church anymore." "Nonsense," Martha said firmly, "and God doesn't check credentials at the door, and besides, I could use the company." The congregation stared when they walked in together, and Martha with her head held high, and Samuel in the clean shirt Martha had found in Thomas's trunk, and they sat in Martha's usual pew. And when Reverend Patterson spoke about mercy and second chances, Martha saw Samuel's shoulders shake and knew he was crying. After the service, several people approached with cool glances and whispered questions, and Martha introduced Samuel as her friend and employee, and said it was kind of them to be so concerned, but she was quite capable of managing her own affairs. "Thank you very much." Walking home, Samuel was quiet until they reached the cottonwood, and then he stopped and turned to Martha with tears in his eyes again. "Why did you do it? And why did you bid on me when you knew what people would say?" Martha considered her answer carefully and watched a hawk circle high above them in the clear blue sky. "Because 3 years ago when Thomas died, I wanted to die too. And the town was kind enough with casseroles and condolences. But what I needed wasn't sympathy. And I needed someone to see that I was still here and still capable of living. And you reminded me that sometimes we all need someone to bid on our humanity when the world has reduced us to a price." Samuel wiped his eyes and nodded. And from that day, something shifted between them, and not romance. Exactly, but something deeper, and a friendship built on mutual understanding and shared loneliness, and the quiet recognition that they had both survived things that might have broken them. As autumn arrived, Samuel transformed the farm in ways Martha hadn't thought possible, and he built a new chicken coop with proper ventilation and repaired the irrigation system, and even added a small workshop where he began taking carpentry jobs from town. At first, people were skeptical, but Samuel's work was beautiful and precise, and soon he was crafting furniture and repairing tools and building cradles for new babies, and gradually the town began to see him not as the man in chains, but as Samuel the carpenter who lived at the Henderson farm. Martha found herself cooking larger meals and humming songs she hadn't hummed in years, and the farmhouse felt alive again, with the sound of Samuel's hammer in the workshop, and his footsteps on the porch, and his quiet company at the supper table. One evening, in late October, as they sat watching the sunset paint the sky orange and pink, Martha asked the question that had been on her mind. "Samuel, do you ever think about leaving and going somewhere new where nobody knows your past?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment and then shook his head. "I used to think that's what I wanted, and a fresh start somewhere else, but I've learned something being here, Martha. And running from the past doesn't heal it. And what heals it is people like you who see your worst moment and offer kindness anyway. And I don't want to run from that, and I want to stay and be worthy of it." Martha felt tears prick her eyes and reached over to squeeze his hand. "You were always worthy, Samuel, and you just needed someone to remind you that winter was the coldest anyone could remember, and snow fell heavy and deep and blanketed the farm in white. And Samuel insisted on taking the spare room finally, when Martha pointed out that the barn wasn't fit for man nor beast in such weather. They fell into an easy routine, and Martha would cook breakfast while Samuel handled the morning chores, and they would work together during the day, and he on his carpentry, and she on her sewing and baking, and in the evenings they would sit by the fire and read or talk or simply enjoy the comfortable silence. The town gossips had plenty to say, of course, about the widow and the former convict living under one roof, but Martha paid them no mind and let them think what they wanted, because she knew the truth, and this was a home built on respect and friendship and mutual salvation. When spring came, Samuel surprised Martha by planting a garden twice the size of her usual one. "We'll need the extra this year," he explained, "and I've been thinking we could sell preserves and vegetables at the market, and maybe even save enough to replace that old plow." Martha laughed, and the sound felt good in her chest. "And when did you start planning?"